Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. We are going to start this important session on the health of land and quality of life. Land is at the center of human geography. It's also at the center of the development agendas. When you think in terms of the past, the present, and the future of humanity, you will see that land was always sustaining as one of the most important ecosystems, the development of humanity. When you think in terms of land and soil and territories and space, you will see that land is a fundamental cultural significance of people, of civilizations, of development. Land speaks about social identity. It speaks about the importance of sense of belonging and understanding. In this evolution, land was always in the most important elements of change of humanity. Think, for instance, in the nomadic change to the settlement. Land was fundamental. The agricultural revolution, later on the industrial agro-development, and fundamentally the urbanization process in which land has played a fundamental role. Land is therefore inextricably linked to land and water development. It's also linked in terms of functionality, in terms of jurisdictions, in terms of territories, to the rural, urban, peri-urban continuum, and the possibilities to understand this from a new economic and geographic perspective. COP16 comes at a very important time, a very critical time for people and the planet. We all know that the goal on land 15, and particularly target 15.3, has been really behind what was expected to be in terms of advancing and reducing land degradation to obtain land neutrality, which is not the case. And this is happening for several reasons. And one simple but important is that land degradation and droughts was always thought to be something invisible, to be something in another place, to be hidden, to be a sort of low-motion disaster that was affecting someone else. But the reality, and perhaps this is the most important progress in recent years, is the conceptual, the operational, the policy understanding that land has consequences in human well-being, in quality of life, in the way we see and think and we future. This side event has as main objective is to rethink again this conceptual relationship. It's for all of us to think fundamentally that when we talk about land, we talk about climate change, we talk about water, we talk about inequalities, we talk about different elements that are interconnected. In the last decades also, different and cascading crises, be then in the environment, in health, in inequalities, in the uneven use of technology, has seriously affected quality of life. The way we think, the way we act, the way we dream, the way we transport related to land has drastically shifted in the last years. And all that has had important consequences in the aggravation of poverty, the aggravation of inequality, in the understanding that biodiversity loss is connected to this relationship, the relation to nature, and of course, at the extreme of all these consequences, forced migration as an important situation of land degradation and droughts. This doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it is estimated that something like 85% of these affected land and drought relations are in the poorest countries and with the poorest societies. We do understand that, and then we understand that the life of land goal has to do with the possibility of understanding that we need to move to the land neutrality. But the reality is that up to date, most countries in their own government policies have not yet integrated this as an environmental, as a policy framework, and therefore very little integration as well of quality of life. COP16 is mentioning something that is fundamental, and we applaud this, that this is a people-centered, it's an inclusive approach to this convention. UNCCD refers to this, but I don't think it's his role to indicate how this is going to happen. And this side event is about that. It's about the possibility of understanding that if we have metrics and we have conditions to measure the situation of people from a global perspective, looking at all the commonalities of how we are equal in terms of equality, but also looking at the contextual differences, we will understand that this index has a lot of interesting ways of looking to development. And one fundamental that is striving to integrate, I would say for the first time in a global scale, objective and subjective indicators in the measurement, and a spatial component to understand land degradation, quality of life, and many things. Looking at this to a quality of life lens, we will understand that it's fundamental to respond for various reasons. Let me mention two. When I was reading and preparing this side event, something that really struck me is that 100 million hectares of land are degraded every year. And I wanted to make a comparison to understand the sense of what is this. And it represents my own country, Mexico, 2 times every year. The territory of Mexico every year is being degraded. And this affects 1.4 billion people in the world. And this, as I mentioned, affects fundamentally the poor. Something similar with drugs. It has to do with the necessity of responding from a different perspective. And in the last minutes that I have, I would like to mention which is this perspective and open the floor to some discussion on this. Number one is the idea that we need to understand that responses are to be a combination of central and local, and we need to look at land tenure, we need to look at urban planning, we need to look at how we can reinforce subnational governments and the presence of communities and what they say, what they think, what they dream, what they aspire in order to be integrated in the equation of quality of life. We need to integrate also when people are moved by force, that we need to create minimum standards in terms of response for that. At the drug level, and we will see with the index that we are presenting to you, the indicators, the matrix, the framework of the index has a clear dialogue with all this situation of the health of land in terms of housing, in terms of basic services, in terms of recreation and culture, in terms of income, and of course, environment. Human mobility is a fundamental element of this, and we will hear how human efforts are necessary to understand where the responsibilities, the accountability resides, how managing and planning for this mobility in terms of protection is fundamental, what kind of standards do we need to create, and how we need to respond to this. In the time that I have left, I would like to tell you that we would like to address 3 fundamental things in this through the quality of life lens. One is the need of a spatial planning component, the need to understand that responses are to be planned and organized from this perspective. The second, in this interaction of territories, governance, I will say, a reinvigorated notion of governance that is fundamental to respond to this. And finally, the migration response to this. I conclude in 15 seconds that I have left that this side event is fundamental to understand that the future of land and the future of quality of life is today. And we need to respond to the health of the state as we need to respond to people's values, people's interests, and integrate these. The index that we are submitting to your consideration will help us to rethink development in this perspective and the way progress is measured. If we do that, I believe that quality of life can aspire to become a common good for all of us. Thank you very much. We are going to start. Thank you. This conversation that was a kind of general introduction to the team. And now we have a keynote speaker. And this keynote speaker is which is Norah Alyusuf. She's the Chief of International Affairs Office. And of course, she's a global expert, very well known on quality of life. She represents the CEO of the Quality of Life Program Center, and she's going to tell us how the convergence between the Quality of Life Index, the initiative that UNDP, UN Habitat, a coalition of countries is putting forward, is going to operate in the future, and this very fine connection of quality of life to the environment and to the future of our society. Norah, you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo. And before I get started, just a big warm welcome to everyone in the room. I know there's a lot going on, and I hope that we keep the content today relevant and you're able to connect to it in some way, shape, or form. I'd like to just take a minute, please, and anchor us all in kind of the concept of quality of life, and specifically how the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Quality of Life Center plays a role in what's happening in the kingdom today under Vision 2030. So the Quality of Life Center in the kingdom is really the custodian of all of the transformative initiatives taking place cross-sector to elevate quality of life underneath this big vision called Vision 2030. We look at quality of life in two different components. We have livability, which you can think of as your hardware, and then you have the lifestyle, which is your software. It's very difficult to work on lifestyle aspects if you do not have the infrastructure in place to support those lifestyle changes. But livability very much is focused on, our built-up environment, our nature around us, anything that has to do with the urban realm. As you know, Vision 2030 also at its core is very focused on delivering on our global agendas that we all have subscribed to, including the Sustainable Development Goals, including climate action, including many other kind of shared common goals across the board. So it is definitely integrated into how we look at things. One thing that we've learned very early on at the center is it's not enough just to have an intervention for the sake of an intervention. It is very important that we are looking at the cause and effects of our various interventions, but more importantly also, are we taking into consideration people's needs? So we come to another theme which is having more prominence today, which is, are we really being human-centric? How are we looking at the top-down, but also the bottom-up? And how are we merging these two things together to ensure that our actions are in the right place, at the right time, for the right reasons? Through this exercise, the program has done over 170 initiatives in the kingdom, cross-sector, and we realized very early on that it was very important to understand what does the concept of quality of life even mean today. It means different things for different people in different contexts. Your quality of life as youth is different than when you're in middle age, which is different when you're in retirement. Quality of life people living in urban settings is very different than people living in rural settings, and so forth and so forth. So I just want everyone to anchor on this notion that quality of life is very much a living, breathing, dynamic, forever changing concept. Its power, though, is it is a place that we can convene. We can all agree. Does anyone in this room not want quality of life for yourselves, for your families, for your loved ones? I mean, I haven't found anyone in the past, 10 years that said no, they don't want some form of quality of life. So in our exercise, what we did as we were engaging with global experts around the world for the past 2 years is we've landed on 9 domains. These 9 domains also we look at through 7 quality of life lenses. You heard Eduardo reference lenses, the quality of life lens. What does that mean? So let me get into that really quickly. The 9 domains are, and I start with the most important one for me, social cohesion. How are our social relationships? How are we as people staying connected with one another, supporting one another, continuing within our local contexts and our social norms? Social cohesion in today's transformative world with digital transformation everywhere is very, very important. The environment is the second domain. Housing, education, basic services, mobility, culture and recreation, governance, economy, health, and well-being. These all sound familiar to you. They should. But what's interesting and when one really needs to realize is that these domains are interconnected, right? You pull a lever on one domain too far, it will affect something else. I'll give an example with an expert that we met with, a mayor in Norway, a city in Norway. He said, we invested very heavily in digital transformation, smart city solutions in our city. Now we're experiencing loneliness. People are not connecting. People are not developing their social relationships. People are suffering from this feeling of disconnectedness. Yet another mayor in Cameroon said, my priority for my people in my city is clean water. I need to have clean water, basic service, something that's very much needed. Because if I don't have clean water, I have illness. If I have illness, children don't go to school, people don't go to work. I have a different set of problems in my city. So I use these two examples just so that you see the range of how this can be affected people. The 7 lenses, the quality of life lenses. So we have these domains that we look at various different issues or problems or challenges. And the 7 lenses are affordability, accessibility, efficiency, safety, choice. Do we have choices? Connectedness, satisfaction, and adequacy. Now, these lenses, why are they important? These lenses are very important for policymakers, right? Because it's not enough just to look at an objective measure for the sake of an objective measure. It is very important that we're looking at these contexts and we're looking at them through different lenses to inform our decisions and how our policies are ultimately going to affect the people that we are looking after. So we're here today to talk about land degradation and desertification. And so I want to connect this concept there. And many of you are probably experts in this realm and understand that there's 3 principles here. And my colleague and my friend Eduardo told me we need to keep things to 3 so everyone remembers the 3 things. Human-environment interaction, right? This is really an important thing because a choice or an action made by the environment or nature affects people. And an action made by people affects our environment. So this is a symbiotic relationship of having kind of a human and the environment interacting together in unison. Resilience and adaptation, this is very important when we look at kind of the principles here. And prevention over cure. And I'm going to come to prevention over cure in a little bit greater detail in how the kingdom today is doing this and connecting to Eduardo's point. I don't have a timer, so I'm going to try to wrap this up very quickly. So in the kingdom, under the Quality of Life program, we are really championing that 3rd principle because it is easier to try to prevent something from happening than to try to recover from something that's happened. And how are we doing this today? There's so many different examples, and you're here at COP16 today, and you're going to engage with some of those interventions that are taking place. But some, to name a few, the Saudi Green Initiative, which is focused on tree planting and campaigns, the restoration of degraded lands, rehabilitation of desertification, promoting sustainable grazing practices. These are just some examples. Combating desertification in the cities, in the urban realm, right? The effects of the urban development that's happened in Riyadh alone, let alone other cities. We've been implementing several key strategic interventions to ensure that we are focusing on that 3rd principle. How are we preventing instead of curing something that's happening? The Quality of Life program has been involved in planting 8 million trees across the kingdom in this year alone. And this initiative will continue and support our success partners in this. We've worked on developing 149 neighborhood parks in different neighborhoods. This, again, It's an environment intervention, but it affects social cohesion and it affects people. It brings people together when there's a public space for them to gather and engage in. We've also executed over 60 different interventions in the urban public realm alone this year, and we will continue to do so. Now, our work doesn't stop here. I want to connect very briefly to the quality of life initiative that we're doing today in partnership with the UN, and how this all came about. As you hear some of these numbers, right, they're impressive numbers, but then the reality is how do we measure the impact of all of this? Do we have the right metrics in place? Do we know that truly we have spent the time and effort and resources and got the desired impact that we wanted for people and planet? So we realized that we had surface KPIs, but we needed to go deeper. And in order to go deeper, this isn't an exercise you do in a silo. You have to leverage the community, the international community. You have to leverage experts across all sectors, whether it's governmental, academia, nonprofits, because they all have their own inputs into the exercise. So we embarked on a very different journey 2 years ago. We embarked on a global consultation. We traveled the world. We met with over 500 different experts, all to anchor the concept of quality of life and make sure that we were delivering on what we felt was needed in this point in time. And that started this journey. Where we are today, as I mentioned, we have the 9 domains, 7 lenses. It's based on the urban monitoring framework. Its innovative piece, though, is it brings components together. It brings global and local. It brings objective, subjective. It brings top-down, bottom-up. And so the whole idea here is we wanted to break the mold, we wanted to innovate, and we wanted to do something that was very much needed in the moment and now. And that's what we will be sharing more insights on as we go. To conclude in my 30 seconds, as I said earlier, quality of life is very much a living, breathing concept. It is going to change. But in today's conversation, I just want to re-echo, an action done by Mother Nature is going to affect people. And our actions as people are going to affect our environment, whether it's natural environment around us or the built-up space. And today we will connect on that principle throughout our conversations and questions. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you very much. Norah, you would have time to perhaps address this more in one of the questions that is connected to the index.
Yeah.
We are going to have now a panel discussion. The 4 are going to be asked different questions, all related to the element that I mentioned associated to the development perspectives of quality of life, land health, and sustainability. And I'm going to start with Marija de Wijn. She is the global coordinator of the Quality of Life Initiative. And I'm going to ask this question, but before I do that, I will take 30 seconds for something. I was yesterday in several meetings here, and I realized something important. And please don't understand as a criticism, but as a fact or a reality of what I saw. Number one is that even those that were presenting metrics, it was very difficult to understand the interactions of the ecosystems, and particularly one fundamental, which is sustainable development or lack of sustainable development. And in this discussion, I noticed all over in the COP that urbanization is always considered as a bad thing. And I would like to bring to your attention that urbanization is an unstoppable force, but with several elements that are positive. But of course, it needs to be done well, and needs to be done properly, and needs to be well managed. In the studies that we did to prepare a policy brief on this session, we realized something. The areas that are degrading faster in terms of soil erosion, in terms of soil grabbing and many things, are closer to urban areas. And that contradicts what I just said, but it's fine. And this contradiction means that we need to understand that this relationship is fundamental in terms of ecosystem relationship for the future. So Marija, I would like if you can tell us, in your view, representing urban UN habitat in this discussion, what is to you the best way to stop these unsustainable practices of land consumption, but also associated to poor planning of urbanization that has very bad outcomes for the environment? Please, you have 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Eduardo, for this introduction and this important question. Now, in addressing it, I really want to emphasize the interconnected nature of unsustainable urbanization, as she also mentioned, land depletion and climate change, acting really as feedback loops that affect land use in both urban areas and in rural contexts. Now, before moving to proposed policy actions, I actually want to give a case example, and I landed on a case of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso to illustrate the points and to make some recommendations. That said, this is not only relevant to African countries or low-income country contexts. In fact, it applies to cities around the world. Now, I had prepared some slides to illustrate this point, but I'm not able to present it to you. So I want you to imagine a place in West Africa, Burkina Faso, and the capital city. And I want to tell you a little bit of a story about this context. So during the past decades, the country has really undergone rapid urbanization, with much of its growth concentrated in the capital city of Ouagadougou. Urbanization in part has been driven by natural population growth, but is also influenced by rural to urban migration, which is compounded by climate change, which has caused droughts and is exacerbating desertification. The context is also affected by land degradation, which is resulting in declining crop yields. And furthermore, there is a context of insecurity, which is really creating a very complex environment for sustainable urbanization. Now, going to the city of Ouagadougou itself, between 1975 and 2019, the population of this city rose from 170,000 to nearly 2.5 million. So this is really a huge increase of 1,300%. And not only is the population of the city growing, the size of the city, its territory is growing as well. So between 2003 and 2021, the city grew with built-up areas increasing by 78%, resulting in an agricultural land loss of 42%. Now, this is not only an issue that is happening in Burkina Faso, but it's something that we see around the world. And according to a UN Habitat study, the size of the city, the territory, actually grows 3 times faster than its actual population, with density decreasing on average with 40%. And Ouagadougou, as in many other cities around the world, this is actually caused by land speculation. And what happens is that in the periphery, investors and real estate companies buy up land from farmers who are often facing land degradation and therefore reduced yields. And so they sell their land to these investors, who then subdivide it in different plots and then resell it at a later stage to individuals at a much higher prices, causing urban sprawl. Now, when this happens, as I mentioned, this causes urban sprawl, and also at the cost of arable and protected lands. And in Ouagadougou, there is actually a very interesting green space. It's called the Green Belt, which was established in 1976. And originally, it stretched 21 kilometers long and it was about 500 meters wide. And it was created to address a number of issues, namely to bring wind and water erosion under control, to produce firewood and create jobs and income, and to provide a space for leisure. But because of this rapid urbanization that the city is facing, as well as poor planning and enforcement, today not much of that space is actually left. Now, recognizing the importance of the green belts, the City Council recently launched a program to reinvigorate it, and it has a number of different components. First, it is replanting, reforestation, and it's engaging women's groups to support the upkeep of the newly planted trees. It's also formalizing the status of vegetable farmers that have been occupying the lands and providing training and awareness-raising activities to farmers to support sustainable agricultural practices. And thereby, the City Council is reinforcing the original intent of the Greenbelt. Now, based on this case, I want to highlight a few policy recommendations. Given the time, I will only address a few, but I want to highlight some. So the first is it highlights really the importance of mixed-use land planning that integrates residential, commercial, and recreational spaces. The second is that we really need to encourage community-based solutions and engaging communities in decision-making and driving community-driven projects. The third point I want to highlight is that we really need to foster rural and urban linkages, strengthen territorial planning, and ensuring policies that that ensure that rural areas benefit from urban growth. And the last point I want to highlight is that of policy enforcement to ensure that we're protecting vulnerable lands in the periphery of urban areas.
Thank you very much, Marija, for this very important response. And I would like to highlight two things that you mentioned in order to connect to the next question that I'm going to address to Markus Appenzeller, who is the Chief Technical Advisor for UNDP and UN Habitat in a very important program for this country, for all countries, but working here, is addressing a systemic reform for spatial planning. The question is the following. And some of the things that you mentioned, but also that we have seen over time, is that if you want to respond to land degradation, if you want to respond to soil erosion, and many of the things that Marija was mentioning in terms of the urbanization process, you need a different form of governance, one that articulates better land and water management, that responds better to what people think and value, and that reconsider the role of local communities, and particularly that rethinks how different territories can be better articulated. Markus, you have 5 minutes to tell us, how do you foresee a reinvigorated notion of governance in order to respond to these issues?
Thank you very much. I think, when you think about governance, to me it's a question that can be anything, So for myself, I try to kind of translate it into systems that, are familiar to me, I kind of understand well. And for me, always this idea of the operation system of a computer comes into mind. As ultimately the thing that negotiates, that organizes processes that are happening in cities, in villages, in rural areas. Because ultimately, all we're doing comes down to land questions when it comes to sort of organizing our lives. It's a constant negotiation between different forces that are interacting, that are sometimes fighting each other, sometimes bonding with each other and kind of developing things. And we need mechanisms that help us organizing it in such a way that it's not always only about economic profit, because that we did for a very, very long time. And it's one of the important causes of the climate change situation we're in. So we need to come up with a different operation system or a different code in that operation system that helps us bringing in other aspects into that. And I think the quality of life initiative as such is identifying what this is about. It's not defining quality of life as GDP per capita, but it's actually defining quality of life as a multi-sectoral, multi-threaded, very complex amalgamation of different motivations. between what we heard earlier, livability and lifestyle. But again, this is also summaries. They are like, you could break it down to, if you want, thousands of different factors that sort of identify your quality of life, my quality of life, and the factors would be actually very different because we're living in a different context. We're living in a different work environment. So all these things have an influence in that. And I think sort of acknowledging the fact that things are actually a bit more complex than we treated them for a very long time, I think is a big achievement of this quality of life initiative. But what, if we talk about this new operation system, what does it actually have to do? What does governments have to look like in the future? I think governance for a long time has been defined as something that, in a way, as the name says, comes from governing, from something that comes sort of from the top down to the bottom, from sort of governments, ruling entities that sort of exercise influence on individuals. And I think we have to change that here to turn it much more into, let's say, an open source system where people can engage in this process, have a much bigger say, a much bigger role in that process, and can actually help accommodating that complexity that we have to embrace, necessarily have to embrace, to actually deal with all these effects of climate change and all the big societal and also economic changes that come with them. To close this thought, I think in the end, we've been talking a lot about people's needs in the past. I think a new operation system should also sort of engage in actually involving people in such a way that the people's wants, what people wish, what they want, actually also become part of a policy development. So less paternalizing and much more sort of engaging with communities, with the individuals to actually shape that future. Because I fear without doing that, we're not going to achieve what we want to do. We're not going to be able to accommodate that complexity that we need to accommodate. With that, we're not going to end up doing something which I think is imperative in this whole discussion around quality of life, climate change adaptation, and sort of looking in the future, which is that the solutions, and this is especially when it comes to land, are actually local solutions. There is no policy solution to a negotiation between your square meters, your plot of land and my plot of land. We have to sit together and discuss it. And I think that is what I think the governance model that we have to embrace for the future needs to deliver. It needs to allow people on a local level to engage and make these decisions, while at the same time serving a national and a global agenda.
Thank you very much, Markus, for your response. I would like to take one thing that you mentioned in order to connect again to Norah. Sorry, Peter, we keep the script as it was. And you mentioned the need of a new open system in which people participation and the engagement of people should be fundamental. I would like to add something there to connect to the question to Norah. Participation in many places is formalistically ticking boxes or concessions from the state. And then we need to move to a human right perspective in the participation, in which we make of the communities real political actors of their own destiny. And I think quality of life is a fundamental element on that. And as you can see, it's not only a metric, it's a governance mechanism in which you make sure that participation and the people are in the correct place to say the things that will have a saying in their own future. So please, Norah, tell us, in your view, how people aspiration, preferences, interests can be articulated, and I would like to come back, of course, to the land degradation and the health of land issues, in a way that you foreseen the quality of life, the likelihood of quality of life informing from a policy perspective with the appropriate method and approaches, and the participation of these communities in order to deal with this complexity that Markus is referring to. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thank you, Markus. There's a concept that we work with in well-being, which is called bioindividuality. And bioindividuality means that no two people are the same, right? You have a unique mind, a unique set of DNA, unique fingerprints, and that the way you see things and the things that you need for your own self can be unique altogether. Now, this concept also feeds kind of the concept of quality of life as well, where we said that no two people's needs are going to necessarily be the same at any given point in time. So what does this really do? We need to be mindful that people's expectations, people's wants, people's needs are also going to be unique and ever evolving, right? Now, how does this connect to what Eduardo is saying? I think, personally, what I've seen over the past 2 decades, there's been really a focus on this kind of one-size-fits-all. I need to standardize, I need to find common frameworks, I need to try to fit everything into a box, right? And what happens here with time is we're designing out what makes us unique. We don't have that white space to celebrate those different local contexts and norms, because again, we're trying to fit into this one-size-fits-all. So in today's kind of forward-looking view, localization is in the spotlight, right? It's about local action. It's about how are we taking some of our global challenges and our global agendas, and how are we designing those interventions at a local level to support where we need to get. And a key ingredient into that is the people, right? You can't have local action without the people underlining it. So it's essentially kind of a value chain or a food chain, and they all need to come together to inform this process, right? And so today, if we look at local dimensions of the Quality of Life Initiative, we're trying to make that the place where the local context and the people's needs and wants can be taken into consideration and can inform that kind of greater good or that greater objective that we're trying to get to collectively as a planet, right? And I think this is the unique structure or governance, as you call it, model of engagement that we're trying to do. We're breaking the mold. It's not about one size fits all. We have universal aspects we all agree to, but there's space to celebrate your uniqueness. There's space to say, these are my priorities in my city, my community, that are going to look different than other communities around the world. And so with the advancements of technology, with the advancements of thinking, with the advancements across the board, there's no reason why we can't achieve this. And that's kind of our big mission that we're trying to do. And there's many ways that we execute this, let's just say. And we're going to be talking a little bit, I think, in the future about how technology plays a role in doing this. But again, I kind of come back to, it's not a one-size-fits-all. What's needed in country A is different than country B. What's needed in community C and D is also going to look differently. So having a model that embraces that and welcomes it instead of penalizing you for not fitting into that square box.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your response. I'm going to move to the last question of this first part of the panel. And I'm going to ask Peter de Clercq, but first to say that it's important to tell you that he was the resident coordinator, but also the humanitarian affair person in 3 countries where mobility and forced displacement was a fundamental thing. And these countries are Somalia, Haiti, and Sudan. And Peter, later on, has become an advisor to the government of Yemen, and also an advisor in these mobility issues. and he's responded in this capacity. Peter, I would like to ask you a question. I think one of the main situations, I would say, even, let me use the word failure of policies and capacities to address land-related issues, quality of life-related issues, is when people decide to move from the place where they were rooted, where their culture was, as said at the beginning, where their livelihoods are, and they are forced to move to another place. And the incredible thing is that the other place where they move is safer to the place where they are. But still, it's a place where it's not very clear many things. Who is responsible? Whose accountability? What kind of responses to address? Which are the minimum standards what we need to keep in terms of quality of life? And my question to you would be, in your large experience in this area, what would be to you what is needed in order to protect, in order to manage, and in order to safeguard populations that are moving on those that are staying and those that are receiving those that move and the situation that generates in terms of quality of life? You have 5 minutes, Peter.
Right. I would like to particularly talk about implementation, because any concept to me is only as relevant as it can be implemented. I want to make a parallel to the HDP nexus that I'm sure you're all aware of. Many people compare this to a unicorn. Everybody talks about it, but nobody's ever seen one. So I'd like to try to translate this a little bit when it comes to the quality of life pertaining to the people on the move. And one of the most concrete manifestations of land degradation and the health of the land are actually that people are on the move. And human mobility, therefore, should be seen as a valid coping mechanism to the quality of life actually falling below a minimum of expectations that people have. Once those expectations, are not met, people will move. Either they will move voluntarily and rationally because they believe that their opportunities are better elsewhere, or that the services and livelihoods are better elsewhere. They may move preemptively because they can see the situation deteriorate, and as a result, they can see the sign on the wall, and they will move in advance of disaster. Or what happens most of the time is that people will be waiting until it's too late, and then it becomes forced displacement. They don't have that choice. It's not like, it is a voluntary thing, so it becomes forced displacement. How have we responded largely to this human mobility, and particularly forced displacement? Well, in a humanitarian manner, because we respond post facto, once it's happened, after it's happened, which means that the response is largely supply-driven. It's driven by, of course, humanitarian action, and humanitarians were set up to respond, not necessarily to preempt. Also, the response to human mobility has been largely externally driven, so external supply chains, external actors, with very little sign of national ownership to all this. So the new approach to human mobility and internal displacement in particular was initiated by a report issued by the Secretary General, the high-level panel report on internal displacement, which was translated in action agenda, which unfortunately was a UN action agenda, so quite exclusive, and in my humble opinion, not inclusive enough and not broad enough. But first of all, in that agenda, we're talking about human mobility and displacement being either climate or conflict-driven, and the link between climate and conflict-driven displacement. There's a very close interlinkage because, conflict can be a catalyst to climate-induced movement or the other way around. What's really important in terms of the development solutions, so looking at solutions as a human development challenge rather than just a humanitarian response, is to understand the underlying causes to conflict and humanitarian suffering. So understand how quality of life standards drop below that minimum. The sustainability of any approach will completely depend on national and local ownership. And if you think that in many internal displacement situations, the government, the state, may be part of the problem or at the center of the problem, it's not an easy thing to understand. But there can be no solution to which a state and the relationship between the state and its citizens is not really the driving factor. So ultimately, we have to go back to that national ownership. Any response to human mobility, particularly forced displacement, has to be risk-informed. So in terms of looking at action, if we take action, particularly preventive action, but also non-action. There is a price to non-action, and the price to non-action is that people will be displaced, that there will be, social incohesion, there will be suffering, there will be economic cost. So a risk-informed approach needs to look at both taking action, not taking action, making a business case for preemptive action, as it were. I want to come quickly now to my experience in Yemen and the work we've done in Yemen in an interagency fashion, but very much led by UNDP. The displacement human mobility situation is dramatic in Yemen. It is a very protracted humanitarian reality. 4.5 million IDPs, which means that 12% of the population is actually displaced, and it's the 5th largest displacement situation globally. What we see, and we see this in many other areas as well, is a spontaneous and traumatic urbanization, an unmanaged urbanization. So people are flowing to very specific locations, a very limited number of locations, mostly the capital. We've seen this in Somalia. Most of you will not realize this, but Somalia is one of the fastest urbanizing countries in the world. People still think of Somalia as a country of camels and goats and roaming populations. In reality, it's a massively urbanizing environment. So this traumatic urbanization is taking place in front of our eyes, and it is not managed. It's simply not managed. It's not preempted. We let it happen, we respond to it, and it becomes into a humanitarian protracted situation. In Yemen, what we try to do is to pilot this new displacement action agenda that the Secretary General has announced, which looks at broader human mobility issues as well. First of all, by understanding the context, having socio-economic profiles of major displacement impacted areas. Because displacement takes place in a context. It's not good enough to just help the internally displaced or even the furthest left behind. You're dealing with a whole context. So by privileging one group over another group, you don't really work on integration, you don't work on solutions. You may be creating already, in fact, the next problem. So a contextual approach, and that's why we provided these socio-economic profiles, which were done in a participatory manner with very much ownership of local authorities, understanding the concept, looking at the same picture and seeing the same thing. That's not an easy thing. And then we came up with what we call the solutions marker. And this is a tool whereby in existing development programs, we integrate the particular interests and the particular sort of disadvantages of internally displaced people, again in a contextual way, in the existing development programs. So rather than coming up with a specific displacement-specific or human mobility-specific program, you build it into existing development programs, whether this is linked to livelihoods, whether it's linked to governance, whether it's linked to social cohesion. You integrate that, and the marker will give you both quantitative and qualitative targets to increase your programmatic focus there. At the same time, of course, it's important that a solution approach to human mobility and displacement is done in an interagency fashion and with full ownership of the government and preferably subnational authorities. And then the level of the municipality comes to mind very quickly when you look at solutions. These are the authorities that are closest to the constituencies, that are best placed to have an ear on the ground, to look at systematically the quality of life of the constituencies and to respond to that rather than letting it happen and letting this develop into a humanitarian situation. The last point I wanted to make, and I'm sure we're going to have more questions on this, is that in terms of our interventions on human mobility and displacement in particular, we should go beyond what I call the do no harm approach. I mean, all those of you that have worked in a humanitarian context will know this do no harm approach. Your interventions should not create further tensions, should not lead to further conflict. But I would say we should go one step beyond that, and interventions have to be designed to particularly promote social cohesion, to particularly promote the cooperation between different groups at the local levels, with the real prospect of stronger social cohesion, stronger unity, and a win-win situation ultimately that advances not just the interest of specific groups, but of the community as a whole under the leadership of the local authorities. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting response. Let me tell you that 2 years ago, I was invited to take, I'm a photographer as well, to take some pictures in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya. And when I was there, and I was mentioning this to Peter before, I was told that 75% of the population living in this camp were born in the camp, 75%. And we are talking about 300,000 people, which is the size of a city in Europe. And obviously, it makes a lot of sense what you are saying in not only addressing humanitarian responses, but connecting to some form of development issues, which I fully agree with you. And I would like to connect, sorry, I was talking when someone was talking, I forgot that I was connected to Marija, because to keep a role in order, I would like to ask a question, and let me do a small introduction to the question. It's when you address even mobility-related issues or land responses in terms of degradation or droughts, it's fundamental to understand the scales where you are acting. And we have seen the work UNDP Habitat is that we need to address the proper scales. For instance, a general territorial scale in which is fundamental, and I heard Fernando yesterday that represents Habitat and UNDP in this, saying that we need to reconfigure the territory in a new form of a system of cities, in order this system of cities to understand that they play a role that can be general to the territory or could be more specific to interact with local communities in different forms. But we need to, from this territorial perspective of planning, to bring the neighborhood, the communities, in something that we used to call the neighborhood ecological responses in these actions. And at these different scales, Marija, I would like to hear from you, what do you think in terms of land use planning associated to land, associated to quality of life, and the need of rethinking scales? And of course, when we rethink scales, and I connect to what Peter mentioned, and also what Markus mentioned, we need to rethink conflict and interactions and the role that different institutions play in that. So, Marija, you have 4 minutes.
Okay, so how, if I understand your question correctly, how different scales of planning interacts with quality of life. And I think quality of life is a really interesting concept. It's everyone knows when you talk about quality of life, everyone knows what you're referring to, but when you actually have to define it, it's actually quite hard. And as Norah mentioned, it may mean different things to different people. But I think what we can all agree on is that it's not just one thing, right? So it's not just having a job, it's not just having a house, it's not just having green spaces surrounding us. It's the interaction, the combination of these things that generate quality of life. And I think in this aspect, urban planning plays a crucial role, and particularly integrated urban planning, in making sure that we have access to the combination of those things and that they're not spread out in a wide scale and prevent urban sprawl, but actually have that close to us. And I think that also really supports aspects of social cohesion, for instance, that we have these spaces we can come together for different functions that are important in our lives. So I think that is the first thing that I want to highlight. That in my previous intervention, I also talked about integrated or territorial development, where we consider how urban development and urbanization actually impacts rural areas as well. So I think that's really crucial, because we're not only talking about quality of life in urban areas, but also in rural contexts. And if we can focus on both of those, then maybe we can solve some of the problems that we're facing today. The second issue that I want to highlight in terms of quality of life, and I think this is something that Markus also referred to, is that, and Norah as well, is that it really focuses our attention on a human-centric perspectives and land use planning that engages communities and responds to their needs, enhances quality of life, while at the same time also addressing issues such as land degradation. And I think the important thing here is that it really shifts away our focus from this dominant kind of like economic growth paradigm to focus more on what people value most. And in that sense, it really allows us to focus more on sustainable urban development. And that's it.
Thank you very much. I can see that we need to be precise with time and manage well the question. I would like, Markus, to ask you a question. One of the key ingredients of positive responses, and many of the things that you mentioned completely resonate on the quality of life program in terms of managing conflict, integrating populations, recreating new institutions for that, is finding the ways population can participate, but from a perspective of trust and from a perspective of promotion of social cohesion. And then I want to move to a soft form of governance in which how this trust and participation and the promotion of social cohesion become an ingredient of success of the policies that we are doing. And of course, the quality of life being a fundamental element of this, because one of the key elements of the quality of life is to promote this social cohesion and the integration of different communities. From your knowledge, your experience, an important thing of Markus is that he is two, and I would say even three things. He's a professional and advisor to the UN, he's an academic, and he's also a professional in terms of architecture and urban planning. All these three things together give us an excellent perspective, I think, to this response, Markus. How do you foresee the role really of the index of the governance and the serious promotion and participation of trust, ownership, and sustainability of communities?
My immediate answer would be, let's see. Because I think there is, and that's the exciting part of it, you know, it's not that there is a sort of a ready-made solution that says, okay, this is going to work. I think this is really sort of a field of experiment, a field of trial and error, of finding out, you know, there's a format of engagement that might be better than others. We might also conclude certain things don't work. But I think it's certainly worth trying as much as possible, and not doing that in a naive way of like, you know, random kind of shooting and something some bird will fall from the sky, but kind of looking also quite consciously into what is already there in these communities. Because wherever I work, and this is me, the professional largely, I always discover an enormous amount of local intelligence on how to do things, because you know, people need to solve problems on a daily basis. People need to sort of find solutions on a daily basis. They're not always great, and we were talking about you know, urban sprawl, which is something which is an example where it's not so great. But there is also, even in that, there is a lot of sort of great solutions that people develop. So we should actually collect them more and also bring them to the attention of other groups that are probably dealing with the same problems across the same culture, but even between cultures there can be solutions. And I mean, this again, me speaking as the practitioner, I see this especially when you work between different continents. The problems are, you know, different because the cultural context is different. The solutions are different because the context is different. But each one can actually learn from the other. And I think that would be something, sort of a great thing for the Quality of Life initiative, to sort of map these and collect these solutions and make them accessible to people in a different context. Which brings me to, I think, the the other side of that problem, which is, and this is very much also relating to the work that me and Fernando and a whole bunch of others are doing now with the Saudi government, is how does this sort of bottom-up approach relate to sort of the top-down system that a state is run actually in most parts of the world. So how do you sort of manage this? How do you sort of keep a degree of coordination on a national level, and at the same time sort of unlock that, creative potential that is there within the urban fabric and within the cities and settlements and the communities that are sort of managing them on a daily basis. And there we're kind of looking into how can we decentralize command in the planning system. How can we and one of the elements is structuring settlements in a different way. How can we make sure that settlements are structured in such a way that actually that local decision making is possible in the first place? Because in Saudi Arabia you have places that are very remote where there's almost nobody, and you have cities like Riyadh where there's a lot of people in a relatively small area despite all the sprawl. How do you actually make systems that can kind of operate in this enormous contrast that we're facing in the country? How does all of that then, and all these individual decisions and all these local communities that make decisions actually tie into sort of that bigger agenda on the national level and actually even beyond that national level? So how can we make sure all these small decisions are kind of the Lego bricks that make the big house? And that is, we don't have an answer yet. We're kind of working on this, but this is one of really the important discussions that we're having in this process. So going back to my first thing, I don't know.
With a very genuine response.
Thank you.
Peter, let me tell you that how the question originated, and I'm glad to say it openly. I wrote to Peter and I said, I'm going to ask you how we can control the mobility of the population and reduce this mobility. And he said to me, we don't do that, we manage. And I like it. And of course, I knew it. I have never worked in that area, but I was 25 years in Habitat, more in research. But I understand that, but in one moment, your words come in a way that are not proper to this. But I want to use this small learning that I'm very grateful that you made, is how you really manage. How do you manage in the sense that when the health of land is degrading, the quality of life is degrading, people are forced to move. What is the fundamental notion of managing in terms of policies and actions, Peter?
I'm glad you corrected that yourself, because that was indeed my first reaction. I started by saying that human mobility and to some extent displacement is a coping mechanism. In a sense, sometimes the people who actually move or displaced are the lucky ones, because we tend to forget that people remain in these conditions that for others are totally unacceptable, and they are unable to move, and they get stuck in this horrific humanitarian reality with violence, with deprivation. So in that sense, if people can move, in a sense they move themselves out of harm's way, even if they move into a difficult situation afterwards. We live in a world, I don't want to become too philosophical, but where sovereignty is very central. More and more states are inward looking. I don't have to give you examples. I think you will understand, when people say this country comes first, it is about ultimately your sovereign responsibility as a country. But being sovereign doesn't mean that you can do what you want with the population. Sovereignty is responsibility, as Francis Deng used to say. So a sovereign state has the responsibility and accountability to people on its territory, its citizens in the first place, but also people who are on the territory of the state, even if they are migrants, even if they come from elsewhere. it is very much in the interest of a state to preemptively deal with human mobility rather than letting it happen. The cost in many aspects will be much higher if we take a responsive approach than if we take a proactive approach. And again, if we can make that convincing case to states, I think we will go a very long way in managing human mobility in a way that is much more responsible. So people don't all flock to very large cities because their livelihoods are dwindling in the countryside, in the rural areas, because pastoralist, nomadic livelihoods, they are reducing in the world. The reality is that stocks are getting larger. The small-scale nomads are basically dying out as a population group, and they move into the city as urban poor. But this can be managed by being more preemptive, by maybe measuring systematically as a state the quality of life of your citizens at subnational levels, so that you can then adjust the context, adjust the conditions in a way that people will not all move to the same place, will all move at the same time. For instance, why does every person on the move has to go to the capital? And we see that there's many countries, we see these huge capitals which become totally unmanageable. Look at Darfur in Sudan, whereby you have 3 totally unsustainable cities. They're going to die. El Fasher is going to die. Niyala is going to die. Jenaina is going to die. There's just not enough water, there are not enough resources. So if this process could be managed, and people could ultimately end up in smaller towns and cities, or conditions could be created that they don't need to move in the first place, that they can maintain their stocks, they can maintain their arable lands, you're looking at it very differently. And that may cost a lot of money, but it will certainly not cost more than having to respond to a humanitarian situation in the end. When I made that business case as a humanitarian coordinator in Somalia, nobody bought into it. Strangely enough, donors are willing to pay every year for the same humanitarian emergency, whether it's flooding or other types of displacement. But if you know that you could preempt that by investing in, for instance, disaster risk resilience or protection, you don't have to pay this money over and over again. The problem is that the mentality is not such that people are willing to preemptively, to intervene. But I think with national ownership on this type of a preemptive approach, with national ownership of guaranteeing or promoting the quality of life in areas that are very prone to displacement and other humanitarian manifestations, I think it will go a very long way of managing, to answer your question, human mobility and displacement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me tell you, we have managed time wonderfully, and I'm very glad because, as I mentioned, I was in some discussions yesterday, and I didn't see the people interacting. And I would like that you think some questions, not that you do a new panel discussion, but you ask a very precise question. And while you think about that, I'm going to use 2-3 minutes to highlight some of the, in my view, most important elements. Please think about these questions, and we will open the floor exactly on time. Important elements from the 4 panelists. Number 1 is this idea that we need a holistic response. I like a lot when it was mentioned that the quality of life program is the custodian of different actions, different actors, and by working together, we can reintegrate in terms of policies in order to respond to 2 interrelated things: livability and lifestyle, one being more the infrastructure, the other the way of living. We need to think in terms of people needs, but also in the variances in these needs and how we integrate real local responses, at the same time understanding there are some global commonalities on what quality of life is. And the index is exactly doing this, with these constitutive 9 elements and the 7 lenses that are, in my view, the way we reframe and we refine and fine-tune the metric in terms of lenses in order to respond to human environment, resilience, adaptation, and prevention. I also would like to highlight that sustainable urban development is really complex. It has to do with land speculation, behaviors, weak governance mechanisms, poor participation of different actors, and some elements are highlighted as possible responses. mixed-use planning, community solutions, based solutions, and the rural-urban interlinkages that are fundamental in order to foster quality-of-life responses. But for that to happen, we need to address this complexity of the governance mechanisms and different forces integrating, responding, and prone to conflict. Governance, in that sense, is the capacity of governments in terms of looking to the future, opening a new system in which people participation and engagement is fundamental. We need to standardize some frameworks in terms of adequate responses. Understand that there are not one solution for everyone, but different forms of responses and manifestations that have to do with some situations in which population, when they move, they need to cope with these mechanisms, but we need to create the opportunities, the minimum standards, and we need to redefine the roles and the authorities and the responsibilities in order to move only from an humanitarian response that very often is external, very often is not creating necessary ownership at two levels, of the communities and also of the local authorities. And these responses, the case of Yemen is a fundamental one with these solution markers that increase programmatic responses and give a new leveraged role to subnational governments to reconfigure new policy responses in what we are doing. I like a lot also the idea of scales of interactions in which quality of life has different dimensions and possibilities of response according to these territories. It's very difficult to address these issues only from a top-down perspective, and which is the real way that we can balance bottom-up with top-down and manage coordination mechanisms in terms of degrees, in terms of reinforcing the social fabric, but also creating the necessary responses at the national territory, understanding that densities, some areas with a critical mass of people, others with much less people, have to do with communities, have to do with connectivity, with infrastructure, and with possibilities. And I conclude by saying that displacement is a humanitarian reality, but responsibilities have to balance this role of the sovereign state in which we manage in a way that we can measure, we can understand, we can have incremental approaches, responses, preempting mechanisms, and integrate a policy in this. I will conclude by saying that the quality of life program and the index will evolve next year to integrate, and Marija is coordinating not only the global program, but also this subset of the index that has to do with the possibility of responding to cities and countries in fragile or conflict situations. Perhaps UNDP, perhaps Peter, to be involved in this program because it's a fundamental one. We can see, no need to name cities, but today many that are real disasters, and we need to have proper mechanisms in monitoring and response. So we have necessary time. There are micros, and there are people with the micros. So please raise your hand and tell us who you are, from where you come, and don't ask a question that is a dissertation. 2 minutes maximum for your question, please. And tell us if you are addressing one specific panelist or is a general question, and panelists will respond as they fit. So please, let's start here.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. My name is Al-Fadi Abdulrahim. I'm from UNDP. So I have a couple of questions. My first question to Norah, you alluded to the measurement of impact. So I would like just to understand what was the outcome of these consultations with 500 exhibits. And would you consider life expectancy or longevity as one of the outcomes of this impact as a life people? And my second question to Peter is, in the intervention you mentioned in Yemen, you mentioned the role of local authority, but what about the communities themselves? And how do you generate consensus among the communities, especially we have the younger cohort of the community would like to stay in the city, and the older generation would like to go back? Thank you.
The second one was addressed to whom?
Peter.
To Peter. Okay. If you agree, Norah and Peter, let's take another questions, and perhaps you can summarize some of them in the interest of time. We have 10 minutes for that. Please name
Abdussaif,
from where you are
UNDP.
coming and your question.
UNDP Yemen and UNDP Saudi Arabia as well. Just, I could not catch from the discussion on the prediction or predictability of the impact of the climate change. Okay, this region is going to be hit very hard, and we have already seen it in a number of countries in the region, that the impact of the climate change, either rise in temperature, severe flooding, or droughts. I love from Dr. Norah on the plantation of trees. I love it. But the issue is that Saudi Arabia is consuming a lot of groundwater resources for irrigation. What are the enablers that are going to be used to make sure that those trees are going to receive quiet water at the time when you have droughts, severe droughts? And the other question which is attached to that one, that we have seen sometimes severe floodings in the region, and including Saudi Arabia, but 80 to 90% of those water either goes to the empty desert or goes to the sea. How can the Saudis benefit from the surface water and save it during the drought seasons? Over.
Thank you very much. We will take another question, and then we will have 6 minutes for responses. So manage your time, Norah and Peter, for the time being now. This is a very interesting question because it has to do with something that we have been advocating with UNDP since the very beginning, is the idea that land has to be managed together with water and sustainable responses to both. So please.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Saliu Toure from UNDP Yemen. So a reflection and a question. The reflection is, yes, the quality of life. Thank you, Norah, for the explanation. But also, I want to bring in the human element or the nuance within the quality of life. You rightfully bring the differences between the youth and the elderly, between the communities, between the rural and urban, and even between countries. I'm sure that the same quality of life between youth in Yemen and in Saudi Arabia or in Peru is not the same. So this individual aspect of this index is very important. And how from someone who is just reading or seeing an index can interpret the differences that are behind this index. And this brings me to what, Peter, what you said about this example of the movement of the mobility, the displacements. When we see, for example, it might be clear if it is the reason for the displacement is mainly for crisis or for security. But when it comes to climate change or environmental degradation or maybe land degradation, the reason for mobility or the reason behind this mobility is usually very individual. We can see two communities facing the same environmental degradation. One might move, displaced, while the other might just stay because for them they see it is still manageable. Or sometimes even within the same community, we can see someone or a group moving because for them they no longer see the quality of their life is threatened, while the neighbor is still there because for him or her it is still acceptable. So this nuance at the individual level is very important. And I want to stress of trying to generalize and have just one index that might not tell really the stories behind what really is there in kind of quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very challenging questions. We have enough time. I would ask Norah, Peter, and if we have time, if you're short in your responses, still I will ask Markus and Marija to say something, Marija, perhaps on this interpretation of differences of the index, and Peter on the embedded element associated to different level of responses and the governance issues. Norah, you were bombarded with questions. Go ahead, please.
Do you mind? Excuse me? Do you mind if I ask one
yes.
more?
Sorry,
Just
I didn't see you.
short
I'm
one.
very sorry.
It's okay. My name is Amal, and I am from Asir Development Authority. It's a region in south of Saudi. And speaking of planning, and quality of life, what kind of tool can we build for engineers who are planners so they would understand the poetry that quality of life is talking about? Because this is honestly a challenge on the ground that we have in Asir. I am a healthcare professional coming into regional planning, and when I talk about quality of life with engineers, they don't really understand that language. So what is the practical tool that could be suggested in order for us to really activate the national and international agenda of diversification and health of the land on the ground for planning purposes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, apologies, I didn't see your hand.
No problem, it's okay.
Noora, please, if
Shall
you
I
can
start?
concentrate responses.
I will try to be as focused as possible, and if anyone wants to speak after this session, I'm happy to have a hallway conversation as well. So, on the first point about measuring impact, right? The key to measuring impact is patience, right? And so impact is not realized with the flip of a switch. Impact in different sectors is more of a longitudinal thing that you need to look at. But where we start with is, are we measuring even the right things to begin with? We measure inputs, we measure outputs, you can measure outcomes. All of these are necessary, but really understanding what is your theory of change? Where are you trying to get to? And making sure that you have those metrics in place and you understand what your end destination is. You're designing for impact. You're reverse engineering, right? And with that, then, you'll know exactly what it is that you need to be measuring. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but just being mindful of that exercise from the beginning is very important. I worked in education and youth empowerment for many years, and we know to realize impact in education, it's a minimum of 5 years. You're not going to see the result of investing in education overnight. So that's just one key thing to keep in mind. On the topic of water management, specifically, I wish my brother was here because he's a plant scientist. They research plants and they do patents on plants. And so the advancements in agriculture today are so vast, I'm not even going to begin to be an expert. But I do know that the kingdom has done a lot of efforts in terms of water management and having programs in place for water management. It's predicted that water in the future is going to be a leading currency, right? Water is predicted to be per liter higher than oil at some point in the future. So really safeguarding that asset and being mindful of our interventions today are very important. And again, I'm sorry, I'm not a water expert, so I can't, but you don't have life without water, right? So it is definitely a key ingredient. But I do know there's a lot of advancements with plants. I'll try to learn more from him, or next time I'll make sure I bring him with me so he can talk about some of the science behind that. Youth interventions. I think the key thing here, what we're trying to do that's very different in previous indices, is we're de-aggregating the data as much as we possibly can. Gender, age, accessibility, these different things. And so when you have a local layer that allows you to tailor and allows you to determine what your data sources are and where you're going to get that data, whether it's statistical data, whether it's emerging data, meaning looking at satellite imagery, mobile ping phone data, you're able to de-aggregate to a different level than you are, let's just say, with traditional statistical sources. I liked what we said earlier. It's not going to be perfect from day one, but the key thing here is the intention there? And do we all agree collectively that we need to design for this? And so far, with engaging with our experts around the world, they all agree, yes, we need to do this. Because again, understanding what youth need is very different than what people in their retirement years need. And in order to do that, we need to have the data, right? So that's kind of the general answer to that, but I can share with you some examples on that. To Amal from Asir, quality of life is a holistic understanding of the different aspects that impact you as an individual. Engineers are trained in kind of certain aspects. So my best advice to you is it's not necessarily a tool that's a one-size-fits-all. It's how are you diversifying your team to make sure that you have different lenses and different expertise informing the process. This is kind of your first step. Are there different standards and criteria to placemaking, to development? Absolutely. But the local context here is important. How are you designing for ASEAN? So you also need to hear from the people there. And are you designing with people from ASEAN's future in mind? So that will look very different than people in, I don't know, Guadalajara in Mexico. I'm trying to come up with some cities from my colleagues here. So it's just really being mindful of that. We at the center do have certain standards that we look at as kind of the bare minimum. We can share those with you, and I believe that we're already in touch with the Development Authority in ASEAN on those things.
Thank you very much, Norah. Difficult questions, and you managed to summarize responses. I would like to ask Peter in 1 minute, because the time is up. Would you like to say something on the question?
Yeah, one minute is going to be very difficult. But okay, I'll speak double quick. First of all, the longer displacement lasts, the more you see a change in lifestyle and change in outlook on life. Young people, it will take a few years, and they will lose their link to the rural areas. They will, even their link to the land, and they'll become urbanized. They'll join the urban poor, very, very likely. So it's extremely important that when you look, that you try to be preemptive, and then when you come up with solutions that involve moving people, that you do this as quickly as possible. And that goes to the question, how voluntary can you be in terms of these solutions? Can that be people's own choice, or does the state play a role in that? I tend to think the latter, but I know for humanitarians that would be very sensitive. At the end of the day, look, the state responsibility is very broad. It's around the social contract, how to meet people's expectations on basic services and livelihoods. And this is where the state needs to interact with its citizens. Again, I'm really fascinated by this quality of life tool as a way for states to understand their citizens and to be responsive to the expectations of those citizens. So I think, again, if we place that at sub-national level, particularly at municipal level, which is closest to the constituencies, I think that's the best possible opportunity to work on appropriate solutions as close as possible to the place where it's all happening in terms of human mobility and displacement. So Saliu, again, I'm also new to the tool, but what I really like about it is the subjective character of it. So it talks about individualizing, in a sense, solutions. We know that any solution will be a composite, because you cannot do individual solutions for everybody. It will be a composite, but at least there is an effort to understand not just, how good is our assistance. I mean, because we have this in the humanitarian world. We have these ways to measure how effective our humanitarian assistance is. No, but people need that in the first place? And what is it that they need? Have we actually listened to them? And this is a really wonderful tool to do that, and to come up then with a composite that ultimately can be implemented, and that can be, a means of delivering services and rights to people to come up with solutions. Sorry, that's longer than 1 minute.
Thank you. I wanted Markus and Marija, but I'm told that we need to conclude. Sorry for that. If some of you would like to have more engagement and discussion in your question and response, please address directly the panelists. I would like just to say one thing on behalf of the Quality of Life Program Center, UN Habitat, and UNDP, to tell all of you, thank you very much. We really appreciate your active participation, and to tell to Nahat and Ayman that if you agree, I'm going to prepare 1 or 2 paragraphs that perhaps we can send to the legacy team working on this, to see if we can embed one of the thinking in what we are doing. That will be extremely rich for that. Thank you to all of you.